I have a few logistical things just to clear up with people. Unfortunately, they're working on the fire alarm system, and so you may hear fire alarms going off. Do not evacuate the building. If there is a real fire, they're going to come by every room and pull us out. So let me introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Dean Baker, who is the co-director of the Center for Economic Policy Research, based in Washington, D.C., where his analysis of up-to-date events is eagerly sought after by anybody that wants to hear something sensible. He recently published a book called The End of Loser Liberalism, Making Markets Progressive, and it can be downloaded free at the website of the Center for Economic Policy Research, cepr.net. Great. So welcome, Dean. Thank you.
Well, thanks. I appreciate being here, and it's great to have Laura on the panel here because we're both from Michigan, so I don't know what that means. You have an all-Michigan panel. And I'm really intimidated having Laura here because she's got a video. She's going to show you all sorts of cool things from Wisconsin. I'm just going to talk about economics, so that's so I'll be quick, but yeah, you'll pay for that. Okay, well, what I want to do is sort of briefly go through at least my take on the downturn. And my reason for doing this is that, maybe I don't have to lecture all the people here, but I think there's a huge amount of confusion about it, and I think it's really important to get the story straight, both so we blame the right people and also so we know how to get out of it. And so I want to sort of give my very simple take on it and say a little bit about how to get out of it. Again, I don't expect most of it will be new to most of the people here, but I think it is important to try and lay things out clearly. So let's see. Okay. 4 points. Let me stand up here so I can see my own slides. In my pocket, yes. Okay. Okay, the main points I want to emphasize, first off, that the housing bubble was central to the downturn. That's not me, okay. Secondly, that the financial crisis was secondary. I'll talk a little bit about this. People do highlight the financial crisis. I think it really was very much secondary. The third point, again, this should be evident that in the short term, the only thing we could really do is have the government fill the demand gap created by the collapse of the bubble, and in the longer term, we have to look to get the dollar down to get the trade deficit closer to balance. Okay, next slide. Okay, first point, just the simple story of the housing bubble. This is kind of amazing to me how, so many economists did not see the housing bubble, and, to this day, they're still like, oh, how could they have seen it? It was so hard to see. And, it was really almost impossible not to see it, anyone looking at it. And, this is just a very simple graph. This is sale prices. I take it back from the early 50s. We actually have data now that goes back, Robert Shiller's gone back to the 1890s. What it shows is that nationwide house prices just track the overall rate of inflation for 100 years, 1896 to 1996. Suddenly, beginning in the mid-90s, coinciding with the stock bubble, you start to get house prices hugely increase in real terms in a way that's never happened before. And there's no explanation, no remotely plausible explanation of the fundamentals. There's nothing going on the demand side. We had a few years of good income growth in the late 90s. But they weren't that good. They were no better than the years we had in the 50s and 60s, and there's obviously no run-up in house prices then. So income growth wasn't that good compared to that earlier period. And of course that ends we get the recession in 2001. So, whatever you could say about income growth, you could say that for the late 90s, but you certainly couldn't say that for the last decade. And, the house prices continued to rise till 2006. Population, if you want to tell a population story, you might have been able to say something in the early 80s, the mid 80s, when the baby boomers were first forming their households, many of them becoming homeowners. By the late 90s, baby boomers, they're beginning to downsize, kids are moving away. There's no population story you could tell. Greenspan once made some comment about, well, we have immigrants, Well, two stories on that. Immigrants are small relative to baby boomers in terms of, their demographic impact. The other thing is you didn't have that many immigrants for buying $450,000 homes. It just didn't make sense. So there wasn't a demand side story. The supply side, Greenspan made some comment about environmental restrictions on building, which is just kind of silly. It wasn't the heyday of environmentalism. It was it wasn't the first time we had restrictions. We had restrictions going back. I always love in the Bay Area. If you go just across the the bay and the Marin Headlands, you have all this beautiful area that's been preserved. Well, that had been a military base. They were going to have all these developments there in like 1960 thereabout, and there was an environmental movement that kept them from building there. You know, environmental restrictions on building aren't new. So it was just a silly thing to say. And we had data on construction, and we were building housing at a near record pace from 2002 to 2006. So the idea that somehow restrictions on supply were keeping us from building, you could just see in the data that wasn't true. So there was no supply and no demand story. And then the other part of the equation, if there was something in the fundamentals of the market, you'd expect to see something going on in rents. And if we look at rents, basically there's almost nothing going on. It goes up a little more rapidly than inflation in the late 90s, and then flattens out for 2001, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you have nothing on the supply side, nothing on the demand side, and nothing comparable going on in rents that might suggest that it's a bubble. But Greenspan didn't see it that way. So so the basic story here is you get an $8 trillion housing bubble, and that was driving the economy. And it drove the economy in two ways. On one hand, it was driving it very directly with the near record rates of construction that we had over those years. So we had residential construction rising about 6% of GDP compared to an average of about 3.5%. It was over 6% at the peak. The other part of the story was people spend based on their housing wealth. So we had $8 trillion in housing wealth, just the normal wealth effect, say 6 cents on a dollar. That translates into about $500 billion a year in additional consumption. So we had this huge consumption boom. The savings rate basically falls to zero. You have a huge construction boom. We're building homes at near record pace. That was what was driving the economy 2002 till the recession in 2007, being driven very directly by the bubble. Okay, and then the bubble burst. Next slide. Okay, well, that was my next slide. So, okay, so what happens when the bubble bursts? Well, we lose a huge amount of demand. So we lose roughly $500 billion in consumption demand. The savings rate falls from, or rises, I should say, from near zero to about 5%. So we lose 500 to 600 billion a year. This is annual demand, by the way. We lose roughly 600 billion in residential construction because instead of building houses at a near record pace, we're building houses at like the lowest pace since World War II. So housing construction, we're at like 300,000 units a year, 300,000 or 400,000. We had been around 2 million. So housing construction just falls through the floor. So we lose about 600 billion a year in annual residential construction demand, 500 billion in housing. There was also a boom, a bubble in non-residential real estate. So it's sort of striking. If you look at non-residential real estate, both in construction and in prices, it basically follows the bubble in residential real estate with about a 1.5 to 2 year lag. So as soon as the residential construction boom starts to level off a little bit, 2005, non-residential construction just goes through the roof. And that, of course, also collapses. There's enormous overbuilding in most areas of non-residential. So in commercial office space, retail space, hotels, most areas of non-residential, you see huge overbuilding. And it's kind of striking to me because, even in Washington, which has been, in the scheme of things, relatively less hit, you can go to, the really prime markets, in DuPont Circle, other areas, you see for sale, for rent everywhere. So it's just kind of striking. Again, I don't want to go too much by anecdote, but just sort of striking if you have a market that's doing relatively well, you see it even there. The last part here is state and local governments, and this is just sort of fallout from the economic collapse. Of course, state and local governments see a huge amount of revenue fall off when you get the downturn, sales tax, income tax, and of course property taxes all fall off, and because state and local governments, for the most part, have to balance their budget, they have no choice but to cut back spending and or raise taxes. Okay, sorry. So we see a cutback in state and local government spending as well, and or some tax increases on the order of about 150 billion a year. Okay, so I summed this up. I get around 1.4, 1.5 trillion. That's not a real hard number, but it's a reasonable ballpark number. What I did here was just put it alongside the stimulus, and the stimulus. I mean, this is again. I am going to speak to you like you're David Brooks. We get this argument about, all these liberals, all these leftists are complaining the stimulus wasn't large enough. Well, the stimulus, I know the number we always hear is 800 billion. But, right off the bat, roughly 100 billion of that was the alternative minimum tax fix. It's done every year. No one ever pays it. No one ever expected to pay it. No one could stand up with a straight face and say that was stimulus. So you get about 700 billion. And then you go, okay, well, how much was spent in 2009, 2010. Well, some of the stimulus is still being spent this year, some's going to be spent next year. Some of it, these are longer term projects, which is fine. But they didn't provide a boost to the economy in 2009 or 2010. So roughly, how much was spent 2009, 2010? About 600 billion or about 300 billion a year. So this is what we're looking at. We're trying to fill a hole on the order of 1.4, 1.5 trillion with 300 billion a year for 2009, 2010. So surprise, 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 it wasn't large enough. So why we get these absurd arguments? I'm referring to David Brooks because he literally said this, in a column just last week. And it just like, why are we arguing? I mean, that no one could say 300 billion is large enough to replace, 1.4, 1.5 trillion in lost demand. So, and this is all, you go back at the time, any number of us who were saying this, I certainly wasn't the only one, many other people were saying it wasn't large enough, but you could even read what Obama's own people were saying about it. They put out a paper, saying what the stimulus will do, and they said it would create between 3 and 4 million jobs if he got what he wanted. Of course, the actual package he got was something less. So, figure the stimulus based on, their own estimates would create 2 to 3 million jobs. We needed between 10 and 12 million. So, great, you got the 2 to 3, but that is not going to replace 10 to 12. So, I mean, that's very simply the story. We just didn't get a big enough stimulus in the short term. And of course, we know that, most of that's wearing off now, most of the federal spending, and the state and local cutbacks are getting even larger because some of that were defrayed by the stimulus money that went to the states 2009, 2010. So we're really in a very bad situation there, just to sum up. Okay, the argument about the financial crisis. I argue that, not to say a financial system is up and running and doing everything fine, but for the most part, I would say it's not having a big impact on the economy. That insofar as there's still problems with the banks, it just doesn't have that big an impact. So first off, in terms of people being able to buy homes, what I'd argue is that, we have a great index on this. The Mortgage Bankers Association has been putting out an index on mortgage applications that dates back at least 2 decades, maybe longer. And what's nice about it is that it's applications. So if we had a story where we had a lot of people who were in principle qualified buyers, people who would have qualified for mortgages, say, I won't say in the peak of the subprime era, but let's say 1996, before the craziness of the subprime market took off. If we had people who felt they were qualified buyers, would have qualified by the normal standards, and they weren't able to get mortgages because banks weren't lending money, what we'd expect to see is that you have a lot of people making 2, 3, 4 applications just to get a single mortgage. And of course, some people might make 2 or 3 or 4 applications and not even get the mortgage. So what we should expect to see is that the mortgage application index would go through the roof. We're not seeing that. The mortgage application index has basically fallen in step with sales. So there's no evidence there that people are applying multiple times to get a mortgage, which I take it to mean that basically the people you expect to get mortgages are getting mortgages, and people, for whatever reason, they're not considered qualified, they're not getting them. But there's nothing unusual about the financial system that way. The second point, and I'll have a graph on this in a second, that unlike Japan, we have many more firms that have direct access to credit markets. We're much less bank-centric than Japan. And those firms could issue bonds, they issue commercial paper, they issue bonds, and they could do so at very low rates. I'll come back to that in a second. The third point, there's a survey done by the National Federation of Independent Businesses that they've been doing for about 25 or 30 years now, where they ask businesses, what's their biggest obstacle, their biggest problem facing them today? And one of the options is the availability and cost of finance. And if you look at the answer to that, it's basically the same as what you would have seen 4 or 5 or 6 years ago. So even the small businesses don't list that as a major problem. So I don't think they're particularly constrained. And the last point, I'll have a graph on this in a second, that if you actually look at investment in equipment and software, it's almost back to its pre-recession level, which suggests to me that basically firms are investing about as much as what you'd expect them to invest, given the severity of the downturn. Okay, this is simply nominal and real interest rates for AAA bonds and BAA bonds. And the point I'm making on this is simply that if you look at interest rates, whether you want to take nominal or real, they're at historically low levels. So in terms of businesses being able to go on capital markets, obviously these are the larger businesses, but still a very big chunk of the economy, they're having very little difficulty raising capital. And of course, if it were the case, again, let's take the financial crisis story that we have a lot of small businesses that are unable to borrow from banks so that they have good investment opportunities they're not able to take advantage of. What we should expect to see is that the bigger businesses that do have capital at very low rates, very low interest rates, they should be running around stealing market share. So if we have all these small businesses that, these stores that would have expansion opportunities, but they're crippled, they can't go to the bank and get a loan, we should expect to see the Walmarts and Starbucks stealing their market left and right. We don't see that. They're sitting on tons of money. They don't see those investment opportunities there. So I don't think there's a plausible story there that businesses are being impeded from investing because they lack access to capital. Clearly the large firms have access to capital. And again, the small firms don't answer when they're asked in a survey that they have a problem getting capital. Okay, this is just the graph, investment in equipment and software. And you note that I'm excluding structures, and my reason for excluding structures is that we have enormous overbuilding there. So it doesn't surprise me. I don't think you can attribute that to access to capital or anything. No one in their right mind is going to go out and build a new mall today, or office building. There's enormous vacancies. So we shouldn't expect to see that. And if we look at what's going on with equipment and software, it's at about 7.3% of GDP. It was at about 8% just before the downturn. We're about where we were in 2003, 2004. I get a kick out of that because Greg Mankiw, had a column in the Times about 2 weeks ago giving Obama advice on how to increase investment in equipment and software. You go, well, we're doing about as good as your president did. So it doesn't, he might not be the best one to be giving advice, or maybe he's giving it to the wrong president. Okay, so ways out of the downturn. Stimulus, what can you do with stimulus? If when President Obama asked me for my suggestions, this is what I'd certainly have on the list as sort of, the things we certainly should be doing. Youth job programs, it just amazes me. I have ideas as to why we don't do this, but it's just kind of incredible. I mean, if you look at the unemployment rate for teenagers or people in their early 20s, it really is incredible. I mean, the decline in employment for people under age 26 is about 3 million. So that's a very big chunk of the unemployment that we're seeing. And of course, for minorities, for African American teens, the unemployment rate is like 45%. And there's good reasons for saying that that's even undercounted. I won't go into that here. But you just sort of say, what would be the downside for saying we're going to have CCC type jobs? Involve rakes, shovels. People clean up parks and streets and fix up abandoned buildings so they're not hazards to the neighborhood. I really can't see the downside to that. It could have a big impact. The second, aid to state and local governments. Again, that just seems kind of a no-brainer. I sort of thought this would be an easy one when Obama first had his first stimulus package. He did include a lot of money for aid to state and local governments, and that was actually one of the biggest things that the Republicans held out on. So when he had to get the two Republicans to go along to get through the filibuster, the biggest cutback was far and away in state and local governments. I just thought that was like, what's going on? I thought they liked state and local governments, and it was only later I realized they were thinking ahead of us, or me at least. They wanted the fiscal crisis at the state level so they could beat up on public sector workers. But if you want to spend money quickly, there's no better way to spend it quickly than keep people from cutting back. So if you got the money in state and local governments, they wouldn't have to make cutbacks to the extent that they're actually doing it. The third is infrastructure, and here the story. Again, when you had the stimulus package, Obama kept emphasizing shovel ready, and of course you want to get money out quickly. But the good or bad side, however you want to put it, we have a long downturn, and they kept thinking as though this is going to be over in 2010. I know when the package was first proposed, there's a big question, how much of this can we spend before 2010? And obviously, you want to spend a lot of it quickly. But, there's good reason to think we'd still need it in 2011, 12, 13. So the idea of having big infrastructure projects like we had in the New Deal that might take 4, 5, or 6 years, that would have made really good sense back in 2009 when you had the first package. I think it still makes sense today because, again, for better or worse, I don't think you tell a plausible story that, even come 2016, 2017, we probably could still use some boost to the economy. And if we're building, projects that we do need, it's not no shortage of infrastructure projects that we do need, it would make good sense. Federal Reserve Board. Federal Reserve Board could do a lot more. My favorite suggestion originates with Krugman, but actually Bernanke wrote it himself when he was still a professor back at Princeton. Target a higher rate of inflation. So Bernanke, the context he wrote it was he was making a recommendation for Japan Central Bank back in 1999, 2000, that they're in a situation with basically zero or a small negative inflation rate, and he's saying, well, what could they do to boost their economy? Deliberately target, say you're going to throw enough money out there to hit 3 or 4% inflation. that made good sense for Japan, I would say it makes good sense for the US. The advantage of targeting a higher inflation rate, well, twofold. One is that, say you got 4% inflation a year, that would help alleviate debt burdens that, wages, assuming wages rise more or less in step with inflation, so people were heavily indebted, their wages would be rising relative to their debt burden. And of course, if house prices more or less followed the rate of inflation, then people underwater in their mortgages would increasingly end up being above water. People would have more equity in their home. So inflation would be, that's one side of it. The other part, of course, is simply that it would reduce the real interest rate for investment purposes. So firms know that, if they're looking to undertake a major investment, that they're going to be, building a factory, producing products, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, or a line of software, or whatever it might be, that, they won't get a payback, they won't have the product to sell for a few years. If they know that prices are going to be 15% higher at that point, that makes it much more profitable to do it. So we'd like to have a much lower real interest rate. We can't get nominal rates below zero. The way you lower the real interest rate is to have somewhat higher inflation. So I think that'd be a great policy. Unfortunately, I don't think we're likely to see that from the Fed. Next. I think we got one more. Yeah, okay. My last two. Work sharing. This is something that's been enormously successful in Europe, and particularly in Germany. The idea being that we give firms an incentive that rather than laying off workers, we get them to reduce work hours. So rather than laying off 20% of your workforce, you have everyone work 20% fewer hours. And Germany's been incredibly successful with this. The unemployment rate in Germany today is about a 0.5 percentage point lower than it was at the start of the downturn. And that's not because they've had more growth than the United States. Their growth's been just about the same as the US over this period. So the difference in unemployment rates is explained by the fact that they've gotten employers to keep workers on the payroll. They simply reduce their work hours, and basically the standard formula in Germany, I don't know if we get anything so generous here, but the standard formula in Germany is that the government makes up 60% of the lost wages. They have the company make up 20% of the lost wages. So you just have workers suffering at, say, 20% pay, 20% of the time off. So if you lose 20% of your hours, your loss in take-home pay is 20% of that, so you lose 4% pay. Again, we probably won't get anything quite so generous here, but that ends up not being such a great hardship for workers and keeps people at the workplace. You avoid the problem of people being unemployed long periods of time, dropping out of the labor force altogether. If we could go that direction here, and there actually is some support for that, I should say, in the Obama administration. It was actually part of his latest jobs plan. Whether we see much come out of that remains to be seen, but there is actually some support for that. It's not a terribly radical proposition on the face of it. The last thing, over the long term, I mean, our major imbalance in the U.S. economy is simply the trade deficit. And we know that if you're running a trade deficit, then it means the country's a net borrower, and that means you either have a budget deficit and or you have negative private savings. And we sort of saw both of that in the last decade, at the peak of the housing bubble, we had large negative private savings. That was both because we were building all these houses that at the end of the day we were overbuilding, and also we had a savings rate of basically zero. So we had negative private savings. Now it's flipped over, we still have the trade deficit, we have a big budget deficit. But if we're not going to, as a country, have either negative private savings and or a large budget deficit, we have to get the trade deficit down closer to zero. It doesn't have to be balanced, but something closer to zero. And the only way I know how to do that is get the dollar down. And unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be really on anyone's agenda in a big way. But over a longer term, I think that's definitely the direction we got to be going, and we have to try to get that on the agenda, because there's not going to be a really good story you could tell as to how you can maintain high levels of employment with the sorts of trade deficits we've been seeing. Okay, I think I got one more there. Okay, so just concluding, we do, just making an argument about long-term unemployment being a really big problem. We are now seeing this story, increasingly told by economists. I don't think we should accept this, but increasingly told by economists that we now have higher structural unemployment because we have so many people who are long-term unemployed. And it ends up being sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy that if you have people out of the labor force for a long period of time, I mean, there is no doubt about it, they're harder to reemploy. And that gives a very strong argument, at least it should be a very strong argument, for taking steps now, having more stimulus, more work sharing, whatever it might be. Second point, again, it's just, it really is incredible that we talk, it's in the media, it's talked about like we can't afford to put people to work. when, you know, the logic is really like 180 degrees at odds. It's really costless to put people to work. I mean, it's you know, what we're doing is we're just wasting resources. We're wasting, you know, we have people want to work, have the skills to work, and we have the capital, and it's just, you know, basically our own stupidity that we end up not having people working. So it really is incredible that we're in this situation. And I'm saying that I have to say this, you know, when I first learned economics, I remember my professor did assign me Keynes in the intro. This is really true. And I remember reading, you know, the general theory, thinking, you know, it's really a shame that Keynes didn't write this a few years earlier, because then we would have avoided the Great Depression. We would have known, you know, I mean, I didn't know the full history at the time, but, you know, but in any case, I thought, you know, if we just had Keynes back in, you know, 1929, we just would have read him and said, wow, we just have to spend lots of money. And, well, that was 70 years ago. We don't really have that excuse today. We didn't have it then either, but, you know. Anyhow, so that was the third point. And the last point is just, you know, I'm down in Washington. I mean, it's just sort of infuriating when you're around all these people who say, well, you know, we're just going to have to live with high rates of we're going to have to live with high rates of unemployment for a period of time. We're just going to have to, you know, tough it out. And needless to say, the people who are saying that, none of them are unemployed. And it is just, you know, you just go, well, why do we have this situation? Well, people like them, and in many cases, those people messed up. I mean, this was an incredible, avoidable blunder, but yet the people who pay the price of it are invariably not the people who made the blunder. And that should have people really, really angry. So I'll stop with that.
Thank you. Our next speaker, Laura Dresser, is the Associate Director of the Center for Wisconsin Strategy. So we can learn some of the experience from Wisconsin. Laura is a labor economist and an activist.
All right. Well, I think I'll just sit on the front of this table. Maybe that'll work. Or will that work okay with this setup? So thank you. I think I'm here to represent the People's Resistance of Wisconsin, which was a pretty, yay! You know, we've waited maybe 30 years for people to say no in a lot of ways, and it was incredible to be in Wisconsin where that finally happened. It's nice that I get to be here. It's nice that I get to be here with Dean, because 20 years ago we were in grad school together. And it's nice that that I get to be here at IRPI, because you know, it's so nice to be around people who would willingly call themselves IRPI. And it was my first exposure to the, you know, the infrastructure of left economics was IRPI. So I think it's nice for me to be here. So thanks for having me. I think in a way also, you know, I am a witness and a supporter and a helper of what happened in Wisconsin, but I am not, you know, in any way its author. In fact, Charity and Molly from the Teaching Assistants Association are much more central to actually doing the work during this uprising. You can hear from them at a panel later today, and you should. But so you know, it's nice that I get to be here. I feel like I'm a little bit, getting an honor that I don't deserve. But it is good to be from Wisconsin, and it was good to get to see it. And I want to share that story with you. Usually I would show slides and graphs of devastation and sorrow like Dean, but today I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to tell you a story and show you a video. But just to provide a little context of what happened in Wisconsin, you know, in some ways, the story begins on February 11th when Scott Walker, the very day that Hosni Mubarak went to his seaside retreat in Egypt, you may remember that day, Scott Walker dropped a bomb in Madison. And I remember actually I couldn't really even process the Scott Walker thing. I just kept reading Egypt stories. That was my sort of, just, oh, okay, I'm going to read another Egypt story. That seems better. But you know, it starts there, and I'll tell a story from there. But in many ways, of course, it goes back to November 2010, when the state governorship flipped, when Russ Feingold lost to a business guy, moron, at the state level. Republican when the Tea Party became ascendant. November 2010 matters. And November 2010 matters, of course, is also very closely related to the financial crisis and the recession, the lack of a language from the Democrats about how they were providing a solution, and the fear that it created. That's the kind of politics that it has generated. But so, back to November, back to this crisis, back to the last 30 years, I think, that we have had a restructuring, as you all know and have documented probably better than I, of the American economy that has pushed the median worker into ever more fearful, has taken more benefits away from them, so that public sector benefits that 30 years ago looked just like everybody else's now look extraordinarily generous. That's part of what sets up public sector workers to get this kind of attack that they've had. That this economic restructuring, so the story of Wisconsin is not just a February 11th story or just an electoral story or just the last recession story, but really the story of the restructuring of the American economy and the way that workers have been at the median and at the bottom have been pushed down in ways that leaves public sector workers more vulnerable. So, and just for a little bit on this, because I think you will see this kind of politics coming out of the Midwest, right? Why the Midwest? This is obvious, but I remind you. First of all, pummeled by the manufacturing recession. So Wisconsin started in the year 2000, 600,000 manufacturing jobs. Today, 450,000 manufacturing jobs. 3 for every 4 we used to have. 3 workers for every 4 we used to have in manufacturing. We're still the most manufacturing dependent state in the nation. We tie with Indiana all the time. But that is a massive working class base of losing 1 in 4 of those jobs over the course of that decade. Midwestern median income that just came out last week across the decade down 15%. The national income, I mean, this is shocking enough and should be remembered and reported and whatever, is down about 9% over the decade, which is historic and completely screwed up, in many ways. But the Midwest is worse. So A, the Midwest is worse. B, the Midwest has unions to kill, right? So in the South, you can't do this because you don't even have unions in the first place, right? And C, you have this fear and this shift going on and a kind of increase in Republican and conservative ideas. That's all going on in the Midwest, so that's the place where the most surprising attacks on unions went on. And that's true, of course, in Wisconsin, but also in Ohio and Michigan, and even a little bit in Indiana. I think that's, sort of obvious, but some of the reasons you'll see that. I can't get this up. All right, so I'm going to do a little quick timeline, then we're going to watch a movie, because a picture of Wisconsin is worth more than 1,000 words, and I only have time for probably 500 anyway. So just a little bit on what happened in the timeline, and then we'll talk a little bit about the effects and what it means. So February 11th, he announces this bill. There had been some mutterings about it before that, but we didn't really know the structure of it until that day. And I think, and then February 14th, the TAA had long planned a kind of delivery of Valentines to Scott Walker to defend the UW. But because of the announcements on February 11th, and because he aspired to move this bill by Wednesday the 16th, Wednesday the 15th, 16th, Wednesday the 16th, because he managed to create a budget deficit by giving a current account budget deficit, by giving away tax breaks to corporations in January. And that required a budget repair fix, which runs on a faster timeline. So much of this relates to the structure of legislation. But just so you know, he drops this massive restructuring of what being in a public sector union means in Wisconsin, essentially eviscerating public sector unions with a pen. And he plans for it to be adopted in less than a week. So that gives a sense of urgency. February 14th, thousands of people show up at the Capitol to deliver these memos. February 15th, which is Tuesday, the students of Madison East High, the school where my son, now a 4th grader, will someday go, walk out of their classes. Thousands of people show up to speak at a hearing in the Capitol. That hearing, the Democrat, they go till 3 in the morning. There's thousands and thousands of people coming to the Capitol to denounce the bill. The Republicans finally shut down the hearing at 3. The Democrats instantly open a hearing in another room in the building. And when there's a hearing in the Capitol in Madison, Wisconsin, the building stays open. And that's what keeps the building open. So that's the beginning of the occupation, is the continuation of that hearing. By Wednesday, February 16th, the Madison schools closed. All the teachers got sick on the same day. The schools shut down, and most of us just take our kids to the Capitol. The Madison teachers stay out from Wednesday till the next Monday. The school doesn't start back up until the next Tuesday. That's when, then Thursday, 17 school districts shut down. Thursday, the senators leave town. The Democratic senators go on the lam to Illinois. You may recall this. They sort of sneak around in Illinois, being followed by Republicans trying to film them. They can't be pursued by the police because they're in another state. So the Senate Democrats leave, and what's, obviously they have the Republican majority, but they need a quorum because it's a budget bill. They need a special 2/3 quorum, so they need some Dems there to make the vote count. Anyway, then so it gets weirder and weirder, but the protests get bigger and bigger. And by February 19th, February 26th, March 12th, hundreds of, up to more than 100,000 people on the state capitol saying no. I just want to add 2 more things to that. Sometime in here, the governor actually explicitly exempts firefighters and police officers from the bill, from the effects of the bill. And there's a kind of beautiful part of solidarity that happens around the Wednesday or the Thursday. And one of the leaders of the firefighters union stands up and says, the House, we're firefighters, and when there's a fire, we respond. And the House of Labor is on fire, and we're here. And they came, yeah. It was, and they came in their full dress with the bagpipes, and it was a very, just a series of beautiful pieces of solidarity from working people, from people who love their teachers, from people who love the services they get from the state, from people who just feel like this was unfair and rude. It was a beautiful, really, confluence, and I think nothing captures it better than a movie. So we're going to run this movie that was made by a TAA member, Shaheen Azadi, and it gives a nice kind of 4-minute sense of what those early, I think it's especially February through early March, felt like in Madison. So that, of course, gives you a little bit, I think, a better sense of what happened in Wisconsin. And I think, to me, what, I know we just have a few minutes here, but I think, if there's a question about what happened in Wisconsin, why did it happen in Wisconsin, why this, I think in a way we had a beautiful confluence of a breathtaking assault on public workers. It is out of scale. It was very out of scale with, I think, Wisconsin norms, its sense of itself as a kind of nice place. Let me tell you, these rallies, it was just a funny thing about these rallies. It's like the nicest rallies you've ever been at. We chanted thank you all the time. When someone talked, there would be like, thank you, thank you, thank you. It was these nicest, super nicest rallies you've ever seen. I actually got tired of chanting thank you. I didn't tell the Wisconsinites that. I mean, I am a Wisconsinite, but they're nicer than me. But so you have this breathtaking assault, and really, I will talk just briefly about the structure of the bill and how it eviscerates unions. And this incredibly short timeline, and really no way to stop it but a movement. I think those three things mattered a lot, that it was really incredibly expansive policy trying to move in less than a week and with every legislative duck in a row. I mean, he had the votes. So there was no plausible inside game. You could imagine maybe flipping one Republican senator. You needed 3 Republican senators to flip, right? The first one maybe you could get, the second one maybe you could get, the third one becomes very, very expensive, right? It's hard to imagine any Republican senator not being given enough to never be the third one in that context. And so there was no legislative game. There had to be something else. And I think very rarely in politics are we presented with a situation that is essentially on the insider game terms, we have lost. What are you going to do? What are you going to do when it is appalling and of this scale? And I think, and in that context, then what happened, I think, is people were appalled. And I think you can see this in the movie. This isn't about standard, like, one union calls a rally, everybody wears the same color shirt and holds the same sign kind of rally, where there's a lot of unity in message, single message or kind of single response. This is everybody making their own damn sign and going to the Capitol. And it means that there are just incredibly inappropriate signs, incredibly brilliant signs, incredibly funny signs, my favorite being a picture of Scott Walker's face on this sign. And the woman's holding the sign. It says, "Does this ass make my sign look big?" It shows you the level of my analysis, that I love that sign more than almost any other sign. But you have people show up. The labor movement provided a lot of infrastructure, buses, stages, et cetera. There's a lot of infrastructure that's going on. There's a lot of traditional organizing that matters to this. But what is really mattering is that people are showing up. And that in some ways, labor knows enough to let that happen. And to see the kind of solidarity. So not only do you see cross-union solidarity, the firefighters and the police being the very obvious example, but then, I'm down there and I am seeing building trades guys. I'm seeing orange-shirted LIUNA guys, laborers, down at the Capitol to defend public sector workers' rights. You could not have guessed this in January. An assault on public sector workers, who's going to show? The whole state. You could not have guessed it. And I think really that's beautiful. So there was a lot of being driven by people. There was a lot of extraordinary solidarity and a lot of creativity. And I think, my last quick thing, because I know you probably want to have a little time, my last quick thing on what that means for us. There's a kind of question on the role of the intellectual in all this. And then there's a question about kind of the broader call. The role of the intellectual, I grace myself with that title. I do a lot of stuff on the Wisconsin economy. I know a lot about the jobs hole we're in or the, income trends or whatever. But in this context, I feel like, facts really didn't matter very much. We moved into a place where another paper on the fact that public sector workers weren't actually overpaid. I mean, we did one, of course, and we dropped that in the middle, but, wasn't going to matter as much as just trying to feed whatever was going on in whatever way somebody wanted me to feed it. So again, I feel like, there's this, we should be ready to be more connected with the people who are organizing, the people who are going to figure out how to resist, et cetera. But also sometimes, actually knowing a lot of facts isn't going to matter that much, and you're just going to spend a lot of time with your kid walking around the Capitol in the cold. And I think, we should continue doing a lot of the documenting of suffering that we do so well, but also the kind of positive program around what is the alternative and how are we going to tax the pigs, and how are we going to change the terms of the debate or the terms of these institutions that are so ruining life for so many people. But the other thing I would say is that, so Madison was magical for this, Wisconsin provided this incredible crisis, right? Because he moved incredibly devastating policy on an incredibly fast timeline in a way that, sort of from the beginning, we knew he was going to win. And that created the crisis. I don't think that, in fact, Wisconsin is so different from everywhere in the United States in terms of how devastating things are, or how much of a crisis there is for working people or democracy in this country. We were lucky in Wisconsin to demonstrate that people will say no. There are some things that are too much, and people will say no. But I think also it forced us all into a different way of working, in a kind of a much more crisis mode of, yes, I disagree with you about that stuff, but I'm going to work with you, and we're going to work together on these things. And labor and community and everybody figured out different things to do because they were in a crisis. And I feel like, that's sort of the call from Wisconsin. We are in a crisis. We don't feel it the same way because it's not moving in a timeline that mobilizes people. But that the changes in the way that the infrastructure of the left worked in Wisconsin during this crisis, because of the understanding of the importance of it, is the kind of change I think that all of us need to embrace, that we need to be more aggressive, more connected to the organizers, more focused on how we're fighting back, rather than just sort of being like, oh yeah, that's too bad. Oh, that policy sucks. And so that to me is, I think, the real lesson of Wisconsin. And so thank you for your time.
Thanks, Laura. I could just kind of supplement on that it was the Wisconsin struggle that I think made it possible to entitle this ERPI conference, The War on the Working Class, because if it was just, oh, life's tough, that would be very depressing. But it's the fact that there is a resistance to it that makes it possible to talk out. I'd also point out that the Occupy Wall Street is now entering the beginning of its third week. And going to be having some speakers from that later on in the day. So let's just open it up for questions. We've got about, maybe 5-10 minutes for questions.
Yeah, the question was if if we followed my recommendations, would we get another housing bubble? Well, first off, I think as a short-term strategy, the ways we have to go are increasing government support for the economy, government stimulus. I don't see any way that on the face of it would lead to a housing bubble. Longer term, I'd like to see us get the trade deficit down.
The building disagrees with you.
The building strongly disagrees. So anyhow, short term, as I said, we need more. So, we need more. Okay, I'm going to try and work around this. We need more stimulus, and that shouldn't promote a bubble. We need to get the trade deficit down. That won't promote a bubble. But furthermore, I think it's actually very easy to prevent a bubble. I mean, Greenspan has, people have let him way off the hook on this one. It is not hard for the Federal Reserve Board to prevent a bubble. I mean, first and foremost, the most simple level, he just could have talked about it. And I don't mean babbling irrational exuberance. He has hundreds of economists that work at the Fed. They could have documented the bubble. Now, people could ignore me when I go out and blab about the bubble. They can't ignore the chair of the Fed. Now, again, it's not his saying irrational exuberance. It's his putting the facts on the table. We have a 100-year-long trend. We have a sharp departure from it. There's absolutely nothing in the fundamentals that can explain that. You can't ignore that. Now, on top of that, the bad mortgage practices, we knew about this. This wasn't a secret. You know, I was getting people from all over the country sending me emails about their friend or their brother or cousin, whoever worked for Countrywide or AmeriQuest, and they're being told to fill in numbers on mortgages for people so they can give them mortgages that they don't qualify for. There's no way on earth they couldn't have known that, and they had ample opportunity to crack down on it. So, you know, when we talk about deregulation, there was a lot of deregulation, a lot of it was irresponsible, but they had all the tools they needed to prevent that bubble. So, you know, if you actually saw house prices begin to rise again, the Fed absolutely should step in and has all the tools necessary to prevent it.
Yes.
You know, the scale of press, there was some national media, there was coverage. You know, I think people, my general sense was there was less coverage than it deserved given its historic nature and given especially, you know, the way that 200 Tea Party people showing up gets covered anywhere. You know, I think in terms of that kind of scale or comparison, you know, it wasn't anywhere near the scale it deserved. Though, in fact, you know, we did have a lot of people in town from the international press and from the national press. So it was covered some. It was not, I would say, you know, NPR didn't, I heard an NPR quote about why they weren't covering Wall Street, the Wall Street occupation, which was a kind of appalling mix of it's not big enough and they're not clear enough on their demands. Like, really, you have a clarity bar for your respondents? I didn't know that. I haven't noticed that. Anyway,
I think they don't apply to candidates.
but not the same scale as I think the Wall Street protest is suffering. But still less coverage than I think in a way it deserved and continues to deserve.